Hello and welcome to Mr. Justin Cochran, who is running for City Clerk in the April 6, 2021 consolidated election. Thank you for participating in this candidate interview. I'll be asking a variety of questions. I will be asking a variety of questions which were developed in a collaboration between the Maine West Westerner student newspaper and Pi Sigma Pi Social Science Honor Society. You will have 2 minutes to share your answer to each one. When the first 2 minutes have passed, I will ask that you only take a few seconds to finish your thought so that we may move on to the next question.
Sounds good.
Let's start now with question 1. We would like to know, if you had 2 minutes to address the people of Des Plaines, what would you say?
So I've lived in Des Plaines since I was 10 years old. I love this community. Even back in college when all my friends were moving out of state into Chicago, I never even considered leaving. I've spent my entire professional life so far in public service, from working at the state archive, serving the residents of the state, and to working as chief of staff for State Rep Moylan, and providing constituent service to the residents of Des Plaines and also the rest of the 55th District. And I believe that with my experience, I can get things done. And I hope that the residents of Des Plaines are willing to give me a chance to give even more to them.
Thank you for your reply.
Mm-hmm.
We will now turn to our second question. Again, you'll have 2 minutes to provide your answer. Our second question is, how do you plan on managing the spread of COVID-19 in our community, and what are your priorities?
Right, so unfortunately, Des Plaines has seen a much higher rate of infection than a lot of surrounding communities so far in the pandemic. And because of that, it's really, really important that we abide by the recommendations by the CDC and the state and county public health departments. As clerk, what I would love to accomplish is to make sure that those recommendations are followed to the T during city functions, like public comments at city council meetings and things like that. Additionally, as an election authority, I hope I can provide some good leadership and ideas when working with other election authorities. So back in March, one of the things we had to deal with was the county closing polling locations at senior facilities. And what they did with those polling locations is they moved them to courthouses. The problem we had with that, and that I had with it personally, was moving them to courthouses not only made it more likely that people wouldn't vote, because if you place an obstacle in the way of somebody voting, they will, some of them, not even bother. So telling them they have to drive to Skokie or to Rolling Meadows, some people are just going to opt not to. And secondly, it made it more dangerous to vote, because in the middle of a pandemic, cramming all of those polling locations indoors at courthouses was just bringing more people into an indoor location. So it was not only less likely they'd vote, but it was more dangerous if they did. And that was despite that we had facilities in the community offering to be used as polling places. So I hope that as clerk, I'd be able to interface with the county clerk's office and provide better solutions to problems like that.
Great. Thank you for sharing your thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
Third question. How do you plan to improve infrastructure, keeping in mind issues such as flooding, rundown areas, sustainability, and climate change?
So I'm pleased that you mentioned climate change specifically with that question, because the levels of flooding that we've seen aren't just a coincidence. Every single year for the last 3 years, we've had record May rainfalls. That means that the city has to be really proactive in its approach. We can't assume that problem is going to go away. This means moving forward with plans to account for future severities in climate change, like increased rains that might overflow the current protections we have. And they've done a pretty good job over the years. It also means strengthening ties with emergency response agencies and nonprofits and coming up with plans for just such a situation. You bring up blighted areas, and that's a good point too, because it's important that we use those areas to develop sustainability projects like community solar and other long-term goals, and make Des Plaines a lot more self-sufficient in its energy policies.
All right, moving on to our fourth question, and that is, what is something that you'd like to see added or changed in the downtown area to provide recreational activities and promote local businesses?
So I'd really love to see more businesses, especially restaurants and stuff like that, brought in. The modus operandi of the city right now with regard to development and bringing in businesses is to provide incentives for developers, like through TIF districts and other methods, and hope that the developments are attractive enough to bring in businesses long term. But ultimately, I think that those same incentives should be offered to the businesses themselves. If you read like the Des Plaines Journal, I read the Speak Out every week. I love that. But residents are right. They complain that a lot of businesses that are really great, they come, but they don't stay long. If that were like a one-off case, then sure, that's a business that took a bad turn. But this has happened over and over and over again at this point, which means that it's a more entrenched problems. A lot of communities around Des Plaines, like surrounding Des Plaines, have thriving bar and restaurant scenes. When the pandemic is over, and it's going to be over eventually, there will be a boom in these areas because these people are going to be excited to return to normal. They're going to want to go out. And if we aren't able to bring in those kinds of businesses, Des Plaines is going to lose out on a material level, not just because they don't have anything to do.
Thank you so much for your explanation. For our fifth question, we'd like to know, if elected, how do you plan to build an equitable relationship with the community and the schools in our city while making your own presence known?
So, yeah, I've thought a lot about this, and one of the ways that we don't really see the city interacting with residents is through direct communication, and I'd love to change that. So one of the ideas I had was to do video updates over the weekend before council meetings and explain to residents online, hey, this is what's on the agenda and here's why it's important. Additionally, as an election authority, as clerk, I would love to reach out to schools in the city and come up with ways to kind of drive home the importance of local participation and voter registration. Young people are the least likely to vote. This is because of lack of registration most of the time. People who are registered are way more likely to get out there, even if it's occasionally. And I believe that this could be accomplished by speaking directly with the studentry and with school staff. But ultimately, to figure out how that would happen, we got to bring the schools to the table and the administrations and talk to them about how something like that can be done.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts. Let's shift now to the sixth question. And for that,
sure.
What do you plan on doing with the city's budget within your term, and what areas of the budget would you prioritize?
So the clerk is a non-voting member of the council, so not a lot of kind of active input on the budget. But when working with the alderman and the mayor on this issue, obviously I'd love to encourage the city to focus more and more on budget incentives that bring in and retain businesses, because that's where you get most of your revenue. However, businesses in Des Plaines have already suffered a ton because of the pandemic. A lot of them have gone out of business, and the ones that have stayed in business are suffering. So I support wholeheartedly a lot of the motions already being made on the council over the last few weeks. So I support the idea of a relief fund to help out these local businesses that have managed to remain in business but are still struggling. But the budget has taken a big shortfall in 2021. So we need to focus first on recovery and then on future growth later on, because we need to come back from where we're at right now.
All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
All right. Let's move on to our next question. How will you promote involvement in local politics, especially for young people?
Yeah. So this goes back to something I said earlier, where I'd love to develop ways in which the clerk's office can work with schools and try to instill a value for local politics. And that means providing, I think, concrete examples, because when I was in high school, I remember being in high school and not having a lot of really concrete examples on how local politics would affect me. It all seemed kind of out there. But the easiest way, you have to let young people know that not only is local politics going to affect them the most in their day-to-day lives, but it's also the easiest way for them to get changes made. It starts with your community. You go upward. But no one's going to listen if you don't show up. So if you look back at the previous 20, 30 years on the council, you see a lot of the same people running over and over and over again. and coming back even after being term limited. We have term limits, but not really, because they can do their 2 terms, take a 4-year vacation, and then run again. And the limited number of people who run and get elected in Des Plaines is a result of the limited number of people who participate. Des Plaines is a city of 58,000 people, and only 7,000 to 8,000 people end up voting in local elections. That's barely a fraction of what we see in the general elections. So that's got to change. And expanding the number of people means convincing them and getting them to believe that this is actually going to matter and participation is important.
All right. Thank you for your response.
Mm-hmm.
Let's move on to our 8th question.
Sure.
As Des Plaines City Clerk, you will have the task of redistricting the city map based on the 2020 census. What strategies will you use to ensure that this process is equitable?
Sure. So a lot of the time when people talk about equity in redistricting, it's along partisan lines, like Democrat, Republican. But Des Plaines, we have nonpartisan local elections. So redistricting still has to be done fairly, but it becomes about other kind of issues. That means looking at population where the changes are happening from census data, because we need to make sure that each ward has approximately the same number of residents. But there's other factors here too. You got to hear from the alderman. We got to bring in the concerns of the residents, because while Des Plaines is just one city, it occupies space in 2 different townships, multiple different park districts, multiple different school districts. And that means some wards have residents that have totally different interests for one or another reason. So for 1 or 2 aldermen to have the brunt of that and have this kind of divided electorate in their ward is an imbalance. So we have to bring everybody to the table, all the aldermen, all the stakeholders, and find the best way to balance that kind of a thing out.
All right. Thank you for your response.
No trouble.
We have just 2 questions left. For our 9th question, we'd like to know, let's say you get elected. When your term is up, how do you envision you will have better helped Des Plaines?
In my loftiest of dreams, I hope that I will have made an impression that tells residents that local government can be the most human and accessible form of government to them, and that they can rely on the clerk's office to strive to keep them informed and updated, and that the clerk's office can be approached to help them figure out how to solve their problems within the city bureaucracy. The more people we hear from, the better. We just need to bring people to the table.
Thank you for sharing those thoughts. Okay, so the final question is, is there anything else that you would like the voters to know?
If you choose to elect me as clerk, I promise I'll always put service before politics. These are really difficult times. A lot of people are having a hard time and they're suffering. I don't think it's any time for partisan bickering. And I think that I can get things done. And I think that I've proven in my years of service to my state and to my community. And I am here to offer even more. And honestly, no matter who you support, I urge you to get out there and to vote on April 6th. And thank you for hearing me out.
Great. Thank you for sharing your thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
That concludes our interview questions. If voters would like more information about your platform or plans, what would be the best way to find out more details?
They can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/JustinForClerk. And very soon, I do plan on starting a newsletter. And throughout the month of February, toward the end of February and throughout March, doing video updates that I will be putting on Facebook and on a YouTube channel.
Great. Thank you again for your participation in this interview and for your interest in serving our community.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.